The black maid welcomed the Korean Mafia boss, but it was the single sentence she spoke that stopped every heart in the room. The air in the Grand Meridian's private hall didn't just turn cold, it shattered. Park Jin-seok, a man whose name causes tremors from the Seoul Stock Exchange to the darkest alleys of Gangnam, stood paralyzed. Behind him, 5 of the syndicate's most lethal enforcers froze like statues, their hands hovering near their jackets. All because of her, all because of Nia. To them, she was a shadow in a navy blue dress, a pair of hands to clear a table, a face to be looked through, not at. They thought she was part of the furniture, invisible, silent, and compliant. They were wrong. When the youngest Park heir reached for his tea, and the world slowed to a crawl, Nia didn't just speak, she commanded. She didn't use the polite Korean of a service worker. She spoke in the language of shadows, an archaic, high-status court dialect lost to time, taught only to the elite advisors who once built empires from the darkness. The luxury lobby's white marble and gold leaf might as well have been a killing floor. Designer suits and obsidian eyes couldn't hide what these men truly were, the architects of a bloody dynasty. Jin-seok had spent his life demanding silence, but now he was struck speechless by a woman the world had taught him to ignore. Nia Holloway knew the price of that silence. At 27, she had perfected the art of being a ghost, too black for the traditionalists, too secretive for the modern world. But as she stood before the most dangerous man in Korea, her posture was unflinching. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a weapon that had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years, and she had just declared war. To the elite guests of the Grand Meridian, the navy blue fabric of Nia Holloway's uniform was less a garment and more a cloaking device. In the mirrored halls of Seoul's most prestigious hotel, Nia had become a master of the immaculate silence. She moved through the corridors with a rhythmic, ghost-like efficiency, her presence registered only by the faint scent of fresh linen and the soft click of her sensible shoes on the polished marble. Her morning ritual was an exercise in erasure. Before the sun had even begun to cast its pale light over the Han River, Nia was at her vanity, pulling her jet-black hair back with a precision that bordered on the military. Not a single strand was permitted to stray. She pinned it into a low, tight bun that sat at the nape of her neck like a knot of iron. This was her armor. Every crease in her white apron was pressed until it could cut paper, and every button on her dress was secured with the knowledge that a loose thread was a crack in her shield. To be a maid at the Meridian was to be a shadow that cleaned up after the light. Nia moved through the sprawling suites of the powerful, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace. She folded silk sheets and arranged crystal carafes, all while maintaining a downward cast to her eyes, a posture of submission that hid the lightning-fast calculations of a strategist. While she worked, she wasn't just dusting surfaces, she was mapping the room. She noted the brand of the encrypted burner phones left on nightstands, the subtle insignias on discarded cufflinks, and the way the air shifted when a particular name was whispered behind closed doors. She had spent years hunting this discipline, a survival trait inherited from a father who had taught her that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who is never remembered. In the staff canteen, she sat alone, her posture upright and her expression a mask of professional boredom. She listened to the other girls gossip in their rapid-fire soul slang about which idol was dadding whom, but Nia remained a silent island. She was a woman existing in the in-between, too dark for the traditionalists of her father's homeland, too foreign for the world she had fled to. She lived for the secrets caught in the margins, a discarded memo in a trash can, a tense phone call overheard in a service elevator, the specific way a bodyguard stood watch outside a suite. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle she had returned to Korea to solve. For 15 years, she had been a ghost in training. Now, as she smoothed the last wrinkle on a king-sized bed, Nia knew the time for haunting was coming to an end. The discipline was perfect. The mask was set. She was ready to be seen, but only on her own terms. The private dining room of the Grand Meridian felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb of gold and silk. Behind the heavy oak doors, the air was thick with the scent of aged pu'er tea and the oppressive weight of unspoken threats. Nia moved along the perimeter of the room, her footsteps swallowed by the plush carpet, her hands busy with a silver tray. To Park Jin-seok and his advisors, she was merely a background element, a moving shadow providing refreshment to the architects of the underworld. At the center of the table sat Jin-seok's son, a boy of barely 7 years, looking small and fragile amidst the men of violence. As a senior enforcer poured the steaming tea into a delicate celadon cup, Nia's gaze swept the table. Her father had once told her that a professional assassin never uses a loud gun when a quiet drop of chemistry will suffice. She saw it then, a detail that a dozen trained bodyguards, blinded by their own arrogance, had completely overlooked. As the steam rose from the boy's cup, it didn't dissipate in the usual white curls. Instead, there was a microscopic oily sheen on the surface, a faint, sickly iridescent swirl that shimmered briefly against the light of the chandelier. It was a subtle discoloration, the signature of a rare, neuroparalytic toxin often favored by the old-world Gwangju chemists Nia's father had once tracked. To the untrained eye, it was a trick of the light. To Nia, it was a death sentence in a porcelain bowl. The boy reached out his small hand, his fingers inching toward the handle. The enforcers remained stoic, their eyes fixed on the doors, anticipating a frontal assault while the true killer was already inside the cup. The tension in the room coiled in Nia's chest like a spring. She knew that the moment she broke her silence, her 10-year invisibility would vanish forever. The shadow would be stepped on by the light. She looked at Jin-seok, who was deep in conversation, oblivious to the fact that his legacy was seconds away from an agonizing end. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of war beneath her crisp white apron. She could stay silent and keep her cover, or she could speak and invite the storm. As the boy's lips neared the rim, the discipline of the maid fell away, replaced by the instinct of the strategist. She didn't hesitate. She didn't whisper. She stepped into the light and took command of the room with a voice that had no business belonging to a maid. The boy's lips were a hair's breadth from the porcelain rim when Nia's hand shot forward, firm and absolute, intercepting the cup. The movement was a blur of navy blue fabric and practiced precision. Before the startled child could cry out, or the enforcers could draw their steel, Nia's voice cut through the heavy silence of the room. It was not the soft, melodic lilt of a service worker. It was a low, resonant resonance that vibrated with the weight of ancient authority. Drop the vessel and retreat 6 paces. The water of the well is poisoned with the breath of the viper. The words were spoken in the Gungjungi, the archaic court dialect used by the Joseon-era shadow strategists, a language that had been dead to the common world for a century. It was a linguistic fossil, a series of tonal commands designed to be heard and obeyed without question. The room froze. Park Jin-seok's hand, which had been reaching for a piece of fruit, stopped midair. His eyes, usually as cold and impenetrable as obsidian, widened with a shock so profound it bordered on physical pain. The 5 enforcers in the background were paralyzed. Their training told them to eliminate the threat, but their cultural DNA, the deep-seated instinct to obey the command voice, held them in a vice grip. Jin-seok stood slowly, his tailored suit jacket straining against his shoulders. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a vacuum of pure tension. With a jerk of his chin, he signaled his men to stand down, though their eyes remained locked on Nia. He stepped around the table, his polished shoes clicking with predatory rhythm on the marble floor until he was inches from her. He loomed over her, a mountain of dark charcoal power, but Nia did not lower her gaze. She stood with her hands clasped politely at her waist, her posture upright and grounded, the quiet authority of her dark complexion glowing under the unforgiving chandelier light. "Who are you?" Jin-seok hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and terror. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the white trim of her uniform as if he expected the fabric to burn him. That dialect! Those are the words of the shadow advisors. That knowledge was buried 15 years ago in a fire in Gwangju. No foreigner, no maid, could have heard those sounds and lived. He leaned closer, his face a mask of disrupted power. "I demand to know whose ghost is speaking through you. How does a woman in an apron know the secret tongue of my father's strategists?" Nia's lips parted slightly, her expression calm but firm. She didn't flinch as his shadow engulfed her. She simply met his gaze with an unflinching clarity that suggested she wasn't just a witness to his history. She was the keeper of its most dangerous keys. heavy silence of the dining room was shattered not by words, but by the rhythmic, muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire blooming in the hallway. Before Jin-seok could process the impossibility of his own shock, the double doors groaned under the weight of a breaching charge. Dust and splinters sprayed across the gold-leafed ceiling. The enforcers reacted instantly, forming a wall of dark charcoal suits around the boss and his son, but Nia saw the flaw in their formation. They were prepared for a fight, not an escape. "They have the elevators and the main stairwell," Nia said, her voice cutting through the rising panic with the same cold, strategic clarity as the dialect she had used moments before. "If you stay here, you are merely choosing the color of your casket." Jin-seok grabbed his son, his eyes darting toward the shattered doorway where shadows were moving with lethal efficiency. "Who sent them?" he hissed, but Nia was already moving toward a nondescript wood-paneled wall near the serving station. "Questions are for the living," she replied, pressing a hidden recessed latch that only a maid who had spent months meticulously cleaning every inch of the mahogany would know. The panel hissed open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit service corridor, the circulatory system of the hotel that the elite never saw. The enforcers hesitated, their instincts screaming against entering a dark, confined space, but Nia didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the table to use as a makeshift pry bar and stepped into the darkness. The laundry chutes lead to the sub-basement, and the steam tunnels connect to the subway line. They don't have the schematics for the service guts of this building. I do. They moved through the invisible world, a labyrinth of concrete and exposed pipes that ran parallel to the opulence they had just left. Nia led the way with a predator's grace, her navy blue uniform blending into the shadows. She knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which steam vents would obscure their heat signatures. Behind her, the most powerful man in Seoul was forced to crouch, his expensive suit catching on rough iron as he clutched his trembling air. Above them, the building groaned as the assassins systematically cleared the floor, their heavy boots thumping against the marble like a heartbeat. Nia stopped at a junction, her hand held up in a silent command. She waited, counting the seconds between the hiss of the pipes. When the rhythm was right, she shoved a heavy metal door open, leading them into the humid, thrumming heart of the boiler room. 20 paces to the freight lift," she whispered, her calm eyes meeting Jin-seok's in the dark. "Once we hit the street, we're ghosts, just like I've been for 15 years. For the first time, Jin-seok didn't look at her as a servant. He looked at her as his only hope for survival. The safe house was a stark departure from the gilded halls of the Meridian. Tucked away in a nondescript corner of Queens, the air smelled of stale coffee and old paper rather than expensive cologne. Jin-seok sat on a low wooden chair, his son finally asleep in the back room, while his enforcers stood guard at the window. The boss looked diminished, his charcoal suit smeared with grease from the steam tunnels, but his eyes remained sharp, fixed on the woman who had pulled him from the wreckage. Nia didn't offer him comfort. Instead, she reached into the collar of her navy blue uniform and pulled out a cord. Suspended from it was a small, intricately carved piece of black jade, half of a circular pendant, the fracture line jagged and ancient. Jin-seok's breath hitched. Without a word, he reached into the hidden pocket of his jacket and produced a small velvet pouch. From it, he drew a matching piece of stone. When Nia stepped forward and placed her half against his, the two pieces clicked together with a chilling, perfect fit. It was the mark of the shadow strategists, a seal that hadn't been seen whole since the night of the Gwangju fire 15 years ago. "My father was the shadow who served your family," Nia said, her voice a steady anchor in the dim room. "And this is the ledger he died to protect." She pulled a weathered, leather-bound book from a floorboard hidden beneath her bed. It wasn't filled with names or numbers, but with hand-drawn maps and the same archaic script she had used in the hotel. He knew the coup was coming even then. He knew that the lawyers and the accountants were poisoning the Park dynasty from the inside, long before they turned to actual venom. Jin-seok ran a trembling thumb over the joined jade. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The maid he had looked through for months was the daughter of the man who had been his father's closest confidant. She was the living legacy of a loyalty he thought had been erased by blood. "He didn't disappear," Nia whispered, her eyes glowing with a decade of suppressed grief and renewed purpose. He was deleted, and the man who ordered it is the same man who just tried to kill your son. She opened the ledger to a page dated 15 years prior, pointing to a signature at the bottom of a fraudulent contract. It was a name Jin-seok trusted implicitly, the head of his legal counsel. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. The boss of the East Coast realized he wasn't just being protected by a maid, he was being educated by a master. Nia Holloway was no longer a ghost. She was the architect of his survival. Nia spread the ledger across the safe house's scarred wooden table, its yellowed pages whispering under the flickering fluorescent light. Jin-seok watched her with a mixture of reverence and desperation. To him, the syndicate's recent communications were a chaotic jumble of stock market tickers and logistics reports, but to Nia, they were a symphony of betrayal written in a language she had learned before she could even read. "The shadow strategists never communicated in darkness," Nia murmured, her fingers tracing the erratic patterns of a digital printout she had intercepted from the hotel's business center. "They hid their intent in the most public spaces, in plain sight." She pointed to a series of seemingly random price fluctuations on the Seoul exchange. To any broker, it looked like standard volatility. But Nia saw the rhythm. She saw the court pulse, a method of intervals her father had mastered to transmit troop movements during the old wars, now adapted for the digital age. "Every third drop in the shipping sector isn't a market loss," she explained, her voice low and focused. "It's a coordinate. Look at the timestamps." She cross-referenced the numbers with a hand-drawn grid from her father's ledger. "They aren't just stealing your money, Jin-seok. They are signaling the arrival of the Gwangju chemists. The traffickers your father exiled 20 years ago are being invited back into the city." Jin-seok leaned in, his face hardening as the fog of the last decade finally began to lift. "The legal counsel," he told me these were ghosts. "Rumors meant to destabilize my confidence." "He didn't just tell you that. He coded it into your daily briefings," Nia countered. She pulled out a stack of internal memos she had scavenged from the executive trash bins over the months. By overlaying a transparent sheet of vellum marked with ancient symbols, she revealed the hidden ink of the shadow dialect. Words that seemed like standard corporate jargon suddenly shifted. Expansion became extermination. Asset liquidation became the removal of the Park heir. The room grew heavy with the weight of the revelation. Nia wasn't just reading data. She was deciphering a death warrant that had been signed months ago. Her unique upbringing, raised in the gritty underworld of Gwangju, but educated in the sharpest tactics of the West, allowed her to see the bridge between the old blood and the new steel. "They used your own pride against you," Nia said, looking up from the table. "They knew you would never suspect the maid, just as you never suspected the man sitting in the office next to yours. But the shadows have ears, and they've been talking for a long time." Jin-seok reached out, touching the ledger as if it were a holy relic. The girl in the navy blue uniform had just handed him the map to his own empire, a map he hadn't even realized he'd lost. The traitors were no longer invisible. Nia had dragged them into the light. In the quiet hum of the safe house, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the heavy, transactional silence of a master and a servant, but the charged stillness of two equals weighing the cost of a war. Jin-seok stood by the window, his reflection caught in the glass, a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who either bowed in terror or plotted in the dark. Fear was the only currency he had ever known, the only proof of his existence. Yet, as he turned to face the woman sitting at the table, he realized the currency was useless here. Nia was not looking at the floor. She was not waiting for permission to breathe. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting calmly on her father's ledger, her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical challenge. In her gaze, there was no tremor of submission, no flicker of the calculated flattery that his advisors wore like masks. She saw him, not as the invincible boss of a criminal empire, but as a man whose house was on fire, a man who had nearly lost his son because he had forgotten how to look at the shadows. "Why aren't you afraid?" Jin-seok asked, his voice rasping, stripped of its usual manufactured thunder. He took a step toward her, his presence looming, a shadow that usually made grown men stammer. I could have you erased for even knowing the things you know. I could end this story right now." Nia didn't blink. The corner of her mouth quirked into the ghost of a smile, not one of mockery, but of a weary, ancient understanding. "You could," she said, her voice a steady, low anchor in the room. "But then you would be alone in a room full of knives, and you would never know which one was meant for your back. Fear is a shield for the weak, Jin-seok. I've lived as a ghost for 15 years. You cannot threaten someone who has already mastered the art of being dead." Jin-seok stopped. The realization hit him with a jarring clarity. Nia was the only person in his world who didn't want anything from him. Not his money, not his mercy, and certainly not his approval. She was there for the truth, for a legacy that predated his own power. For the first time in his life, the boss of the Park Syndicate felt the crushing weight of his own crown, and he realized that the woman in the navy blue uniform was the only one strong enough to help him carry it. The power dynamic that had defined their lives for months inverted in a single heartbeat. He wasn't her protector, he was her student. And as he looked into her unflinching eyes, he finally stopped being a boss and started being a survivor. The transition from Nia Holloway to the woman who would dismantle an empire began with the shedding of her navy blue polyester. In a dimly lit dressing room far from the service tunnels, the crisp white apron was discarded, replaced by a floor-length gown of midnight silk that clung to her like liquid obsidian. Her hair, once pinned into a utilitarian knot, now flowed in a sophisticated, sculptural wave that framed her high cheekbones and luminous skin. With a final touch of deep crimson on her lips, the maid was gone. In her place stood a high society ghost, a woman of mystery whose presence demanded the very attention she had spent a decade avoiding. The gala was a sea of false smiles and champagne, a gathering of the city's most dangerous predators disguised as philanthropists. Nia moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, her heels clicking against the marble with a newfound rhythm. She wasn't carrying a tray tonight. She was carrying the weight of 15 years of silent observation. Beside her, Jin-seok walked with a stiff, guarded pride, playing the role of the dutiful boss while Nia acted as the secret blade at his side. Across the ballroom, standing near the towering glass walls that overlooked the neon pulse of Seoul, was the syndicate's chief legal counsel. He looked every bit the pillar of stability, his silver hair catching the light as he laughed with a group of investors. He was the man who had translated her father's life into a series of expendable footnotes. Nia felt the cold fire of justice stirring in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. Her father had taught her that a strategist never reveals her hand until the game is already won. She approached him not as a servant, but as a peer. When the counsel turned, his practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked at her skin, her gown, her unflinching gaze, and he saw a stranger. Yet there was something in the way she held herself that triggered a dormant fear. "The records of the Gwangju fire were never quite complete, were they?" Nia said, her voice a low, melodic strike that sliced through the ambient chatter. She used the same high-status dialect from the hotel, but this time it was laced with the sharp edge of an executioner's sword. The counsel's glass trembled. He looked at Jin-seok, then back at Nia, the realization dawning on him like a slow-acting poison. The invisible girl from the hallways had finally stepped out of the shadows, and she had brought the truth with her. The music continued to play, but for the man who had framed her father, the room had already gone silent. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. The aftermath of the gala felt like the cooling of a long-forged blade. The chief legal counsel had been led away in a silence more terrifying than any scream, his legacy dismantled by the digital evidence Nia had pulled from the dark. As the first light of dawn touched the glass spires of Seoul, the heavy oak doors of the Park family's private sanctums swung open. This time, Nia did not enter with a silver tray or a downward gaze. She walked at Jin-seok's side, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor, her presence radiating a gravity that pulled the attention of every remaining lieutenant in the room. At the head of the massive obsidian table sat an empty chair, the seat traditionally reserved for the shadow strategist, a position that had remained vacant since the night Nia's father was erased. Jin-seok paused, looking at the chair and then at Nia. The room held its breath. The men who had spent months walking past Nia without a second glance now struggled to reconcile the image of the maid with the woman who had outmaneuvered a 20-year conspiracy. My father once told me that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who sees everything and is seen by no one, Jin-seok said, his voice echoing with a profound, newfound respect. He pulled the chair out, a silent invitation that bridged 15 years of fracture. But a shadow cannot lead a family through a storm. We need someone who exists in both worlds. Nia stood at the head of the table, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the syndicate's elite. She saw their lingering shock, their dawning realization, and finally, their submission. She thought of the navy blue uniform she had left behind, the armor of invisibility that had kept her alive, and realized she no longer needed it. She had found the truth of her father's death, but in doing so, she had discovered the strength of her own life. She sat down, her hands clasping over the joined jade pendant that now rested openly on the table. I spent a decade learning how to be nothing, Nia said, her voice resonant and calm, only to realize that being overlooked gave me the power to see exactly how to fix what was broken. We are no longer building an empire on blood and silence. We are building it on the truth that the shadows have finally come home. At that moment, the fracture was healed. Nia Holloway was no longer a ghost, a maid, or an outsider. She was the bridge between a forgotten past and a lethal future. The person they had all overlooked was now the only one who could see the path forward, and as the lieutenants bowed their heads in unison, the message was clear. The maid was gone, and the strategist had taken her throne.